Hello, my friend. December 18th, 2025. I didn't really read books during the day. I spent all my time just editing my next video. Okay, let me just read for a few minutes before I meditate and go to sleep. By the time I finished my first call, I'd made up my mind to use a brine system in rebuilding the woman rink. The city, in fact, had finally come to the same conclusion. The only difference was that they first wasted 6 years and millions of dollars. I soon discovered that the city's incompetence on the woman rink project had extended to a very imaginable detail, large and small. On June 16, 1 week after I'd made my deal to take over rebuilding the rink, a city report was released on mistakes made at the woman rink over the past 6 years. The study had taken 15 months to complete, 4 times what I had given myself to totally rebuild the rink. Worse yet, while the report provided endless examples of incompetence, it came to absolutely no conclusions about who was responsible for the fiasco and what could be done to avoid such failures in the future. The one thing the report did provide was an astounding chronology of sloppiness, indecision, incompetence, and sheer stupidity. If it weren't so pathetic, it would have been almost comical. The city first closed the rink for renovations in June 1980. By the time plans had been drawn and the bidding process completed, almost a year had passed. In March 1981, work finally began on installing approximately 22 miles of the very delicate, expensive copper piping used in a freon cooling system. In the meantime, however, the Parks Department had second thoughts about where to locate the compressor room and what sort of refrigeration equipment to use. Even as the piping was being installed, all work was halted on the equipment that would eventually be needed to operate the rink's cooling system. Even if the ice-making equipment had been finished and installed, the design of the rink was such that it never had a chance of working. Specifically, the base of the rink was designed on a pitch, so that it was approximately 8 inches higher at one end than at the other. The pitch had a purpose. The fact that it ended up being 11 inches was an accident. The point of the pitch was that during the summer, the city hoped to use the rink as a reflecting pond, and apparently a pond reflects light better if its base is sloped. In the winter, however, that same sloped base would cause a problem. It doesn't take a genius to realize that when you try to make ice under those circumstances, there are only 2 possibilities. The better one is that ice will form, but that because the depth of the water varies, the consistency of the ice won't be uniform. The worse and far more likely result is that the water at the deeper end of the rink simply won't freeze at all, no matter how powerful the ice-making machinery. Even that issue soon became secondary. In July, 2 months after the laying of the pipes began, a torrential rain flooded the rink, depositing a thick layer of silt on the newly laid pipes. It wasn't until September that Parks Department finally got around to hiring a crew to repair the damage. In the meantime, a new dispute had emerged within the Parks Department about how the concrete sidewalk surrounding the rink should be designed. The result was that the pouring of all concrete, including the concrete meant to form the rink's base, was held up 9 months while a debate over the sidewalk raged on. So unfortunately did winter. For 9 months, the newly laid delicate copper pipes were exposed to horrible weather. There were major storms and flooding. In addition, because copper is quite valuable, vandals climbed over the fences and tried to cut off pieces of the pipe to resell. By the spring, it was as if those 22 miles of pipes had been through a wall. Nonetheless, not one person thought to check them for possible damage. In June of 1982, 2 years after the rink was first closed, the concrete was finally poured over the untested copper pipes. Contractors often use a vibrating machine when they pour over uneven surfaces, since it helps prevent bubbles from forming. However, the vibrating had an unforeseen result. It began shaking loose the joints of the copper pipes. At the same time, the contractor had even bigger problems to contend with. He had underestimated by a great deal how much concrete it would take to cover the rink. The key to pouring concrete is to do it all at once, on a continuous basis, because that's the only way to ensure it will adhere and mesh uniformly. Rather than interrupt his pour, the contractor decided to dilute his concrete mixture with water. It was a recipe for disaster. Less than a week went by before cracks began appearing on the surface of the newly poured concrete slab. Not coincidentally, the cracks were concentrated at the end of the rink where the cement content had been diluted, and where the vibrating machine had been turned off. Delays in deciding where to locate the refrigeration equipment prompted another problem. By the time the city made its decision, after 16 months of deliberations, the contractor originally hired to install the equipment insisted on a modification of his original agreement. Specifically, he demanded more money. Those negotiations took another 12 months, and it wasn't until July 1983 that the city approved a new contract on the contractor's terms. The completion date on installation of the refrigeration equipment was pushed forward yet again to September 1984. In the late fall of 1984, the system was finally tested for the first time. It proved unable to sustain pressure for long enough to create ice because it turned out that there were leaks in the pipes beneath the concrete slab. Between October and December of 1984, 6 leaks were found and repaired. No luck, the system was tested again and still couldn't make ice. It was at that point that I called Henry Stern and made my first offer to take over construction of the rink. When he turned me down, I said, "Listen, would you like to walk over together and take a look, and perhaps I can at least make some suggestions?" A few days later, in the dead of winter, we walked over to the rink. I was shocked by what I saw. There were literally hundreds of tiny cracks in the concrete slab. Worse than that, there were at least a dozen huge gaping holes cut into the slab at various places. When I inquired, I found out that the holes had been cut through the concrete in order to get at the leaks in the pipes underneath. Unfortunately, the jackhammers used to make holes in concrete are very violent, and the pipes underneath are very delicate. In the effort to get at the leaking pipes, these violent men with their violent jackhammers actually made the problem much worse. Right then and there, I turned to Stern and said, "You have a major problem. You'll never find these leaks. In the meantime, you'll just create bigger leaks. Forget it. Start all over." Henry tried to be polite, but it was clear that the starting over was the last thing he'd consider. In the spring of 1985, the city came up with a wonderful new idea. At a cost of $200,000, they hired an outside engineering consultant to study why frame was leaking from the pipes and to recommend solutions. The firm promised to have its report within 4 months. 9 months later, in December 1985, the firm announced that they'd been unable to isolate the cause of the leaks. Nearly 6 years had now passed since the Woman Rink was first closed for renovations. Nearly $13 million had been spent on the effort. The Parks Department finally concluded that the Freon system would have to be scrapped and replaced by a brine system. On May 21, 1986, they announced the new $3 million renovation plan and the 18-month timetable. That was when I finally convinced the city to let me take over. By mid-June, when the Board of Estimate approved the deal I negotiated with the city, I had already begun work. One thing I discovered was that the city had agreed to pay a $150,000 fee to yet another consulting company, this time to to provide recommendations about how to build the rink with the brine system. The city's contract specified that the company, St. Onge Roth Associates, would begin work on July 1, 1986, and deliver its report by the end of December. In other words, I had agreed to finish rebuilding the rink before the city was scheduled to get the report on how it ought to be done. On the off chance that the consultants might have some intelligent suggestions, I decided to sit down with them. I probably shouldn't have been surprised by what I discovered. The two gentlemen who ran the firm were specialists in refrigeration but had never before been involved in building a skating rink. They hadn't the faintest idea what it entailed. So much for their help. I hired Simcoe to build the refrigeration and piping equipment for the system and to advise me generally. To build the rink itself, I hired HRH, the construction company that had already built the Hyatt and Trump Tower for me and had proved themselves high-quality general contractors. In this case, they generously offered to do the work at cost. Meanwhile, Chase Manhattan, with whom I had a long banking relationship, stepped forward and offered to lend all the money for construction, again at no profit. It was the sort of project everyone could relate to and appreciate. When I went to see the rink, things were even worse than I had imagined. For example, there were gaping holes in the roof of the skater's house, and the result had been massive water damage to the interior of the building. But even the smaller things I noticed reflected the city's approach to the job. For example, as I walked into the rink, I came upon a row of canvas sacks, abandoned and half covered by weeds. When I looked inside, I discovered that the sacks were filled with plants, which were once intended to be part of the new landscaping. Instead, they had been left on the ground, unopened, and had died. Just as I was making this discovery, a city worker walked by and stepped right on one of the few living plants on the site. He didn't look back. In a way, it was a perfect metaphor. The rink being trampled by one of the people who was being paid to fix it. The incident reminded me of a time, several years earlier, when I was walking by the rink on a beautiful summer day. It was about 2 in the afternoon, and there, right in the middle of the unfinished rink, were perhaps 30 laborers. Not one of them was working. I figured they were on coffee break. Perhaps an hour later, I walked past the rink again. The same men were there in exactly the same positions as if they were on a permanent siesta. I didn't fully realize the implications of the scene at the time. Now I saw it as a symptom of the bigger problem at Woman Rink. There was absolutely no one in charge. Leadership is perhaps the key to getting any job done. There wasn't a single day when I didn't check on the progress we were making on the rink. Most days I visited the site personally. I'd given myself 6 months to finish, and based on the city's record, meeting that deadline would be a minor miracle. By my own calculations, however, 6 months actually left me a cushion of a month, in case anything significant did go wrong. If absolutely everything went right, I felt it was possible we'd finish the job in 4 months. One of the first decisions we made was to build the new rink on top of the old one, rather than rip it all together. By the 1st of August, we were able to lay a level sub-base for the new rink, on top of which we would install the piping and pour the concrete for a flat-bottom rink. Simcoe was busy building 2 huge 35,000-pound refrigeration units. I hadn't realized when I offered to take on the job how big Woman Rink actually is. At nearly 3/4 of an acre, it is one of the largest man-made skating rinks in the country. Even before we began construction, we were besieged by calls from the press seeking progress reports. Reporters who normally had no interest whatsoever in construction suddenly wanted to know the smallest details about the laying of the pipe, the pouring of concrete, and the building of a compressor room. After the first dozen or so calls, I decided to hold a press conference to answer everyone's questions in a single forum. On August 7th, with only the subfloor in place, we met the press at the rink. To my surprise, perhaps 3 dozen reporters, photographers, and cameramen showed up, including representatives from every local television station and both wire services. I had no earth-shaking news to announce, but all I could report was that everything was proceeding right on schedule and that we expected to be open by December. That was enough. The next day, there were stories in every newspaper with headlines like "Trump has an ice surprise for skaters" and "Trump puts the icing on woman cake." There were those who said I went a little overboard holding press conferences about woman rink. Perhaps they are right, but I can only say that the press couldn't get enough of this story. At least a dozen reporters showed up for every press conference we held. Nor did the story of the rink generate just local attention. Dozens of newspapers as far away as Miami, Detroit, and Los Angeles ran long pieces about the woman rink saga. Time magazine devoted a full page in its Nation section to the story. It was a simple, accessible drama about the contrast between governmental incompetence and the power of effective private enterprise. From September 7th through 10th, we led 22 miles of pipes. On September 11th, a convoy of cement trucks arrived and we began a continuous pour that lasted 10 hours. There was no shortage of cement. The next day, when the engineers checked to see how evenly the pour had turned out, it was perfectly level. On September 15th, the newly built refrigeration equipment was installed in the renovated compressor room. The only obstacle left was the heat. On the day we poured the concrete, the temperature climbed to 87 degrees. It occurred to me that we were going to be ready for skaters before the weather was ready for us. By the end of September, all of our ice-making equipment was in place. All we needed to test our system was a succession of 4 days during which the temperature stayed below 55 degrees. Instead, for 2 weeks, one beautiful, unseasonably warm day followed another. For the first time in my life, I found myself wishing for winter. Finally, on October 12th, the temperature dropped below 55 and it stayed down for several days. On October 15th, we conducted our first test of the new system, sending brines through the piping. There were no leaks and the pressure held. That night, following a rainfall, ice formed on the rink, beautiful, clear, long-awaited ice. It was almost 4 months to the day since I had gotten approval to renovate the rink. We'd also managed to come in more than $750,000 under our $3 million budget. With the city's blessing, we used the leftover money to renovate the adjacent skate house and restaurant. During most of the construction, the city stayed out of our way, in large part because I instructed my men to keep park officials off the site. When they did try to interfere, it invariably turned into disaster. As an example, after we'd finished the rink, a crew from the parks department showed up carrying a small tree, which they announced the city wanted to plant in my honor. It wasn't enough for 1 or 2 guys to handle the job. A crew of perhaps a half-dozen men came, among them a park horticulturist to supervise the job. The tree itself was transported in a tractor with a backhoe loader. By total coincidence, I walked up to the rink just as the men were beginning to plant the tree. It happened to be one of the ugliest, scrawniest little trees you are ever likely to see. I could have lived with that. What got me absolutely nuts was the way they were planting the trees. Just the previous day, we'd planted beautiful spearmint sod all around the perimeter of the rink. It had rained the night before and the ground under the newly planted grass was soft. What do these men do but drive their tractor right over the new grass, completely trampling it? In a matter of minutes, these 6 men, most of whom weren't needed in the first place, managed to totally destroy a beautiful planting job that had taken 2 days to complete and now would require 3 months to grow back in. Around this time, I got a letter from Gordon Davis, the park's commissioner before Henry Stern. Davis wrote to say that as the person primarily responsible for the early problems at the rink, he was delighted and relieved to see how superbly mistakes had been corrected. I happened to deliver that Davis was far from the only person responsible, but what struck me most about his gracious attitude was how radically it contrasted with that of Henry Stern. Throughout the Woman project, Stern took numerous opportunities to minimize to reporters what we were accomplishing. The Daily News, noting one particularly snide comment Stern made, snapped back in an editorial. Try saying thanks, Henry, they wrote. It's more dignified under the circumstances. Koch himself was not exactly effusive about what we'd accomplished. Again, I think the media may have been a factor. In October, all the local newspapers ran stories that surely must have made him a little defensive. The Times, for example, ran a lead editorial that began, New York City bungled the job of reopening women's skating rink for 6 years, wasting millions, and ended by saying, the lessons of the woman rink ought not to be forgotten. Whenever they were asked, both Koch and Stern told reporters that after the job was done, the city intended to meet with me and my people to see whether the lessons of woman rink could be applied to other city projects. If I heard them make that statement once, I must have heard it a dozen times, including in several speeches on November 13th, the day we officially opened the rink to the public. I'd yet to get a call from any city official seeking a meeting. I can't honestly say I'm surprised. The bad press has died down, and that's all any of them were really concerned about. Still, I believe there are some lessons the city could take away from what we accomplished at Woman Rink. At one point, Koch offered his own explanation for why we were able to do what the city could not. Trump put in a cushion, Koch said, and then he was able to reduce it by working as hard as he could with an elite crew who knew that if they screwed up the job, they would never work for Donald Trump again. That explanation was totally wrong. What Koch didn't understand is that the city could have done some of the very same things I did. I'm not suggesting they would have been able to complete the job in 5 months as I did, or even in 6 months. But there is no conceivable excuse for not completing it in a year, much less for failing for 6 years. That's incompetence, plain and simple. And incompetence was at the heart of this whole sad saga. City officials invariably cite 2 reasons why they can't move as quickly as private developers. The first is that by law, the city must award any contract to the lowest bidder, regardless of whether that person is best qualified to do the work. There is at least a partial solution. Objective qualifying standards ought to be adopted for any bidder on a city job. Probable past performance, for example, should be required across the board. In addition, any contractor who does good work for the city, coming in on time and on budget, ought to be given priority on future city jobs. The other disadvantaged city official cite is the so-called Wikis law. It requires that on any public construction job budgeted over $50,000, the work must be divided among at least 4 separate contractors. The law was designed to increase competition and reduce building costs, but it does just the opposite. No single general contractor is permitted to have overall responsibility, and the result is frequent delays, disputes, and overruns. I don't deny that these laws put a crimp on the city, but I believe a far bigger problem is leadership. I know from my own experience that the only way to get even the best contractor to finish a job on time and on budget is to lean on him very, very hard. You can get any job done through the sheer force of will, and by knowing what you're talking about. As it is now, a contractor will come in and say to a city official, I'm sorry, but we've run into this problem. and we are going to need another $1 million or $2 million to finish the job. No one argues back because virtually no one in city government knows anything about construction. Worst of all, no one in the city government bureaucracy is held accountable for failure. I'll give you what I consider the classic example. Back in 1984, by which time the city had already spent 4 years trying to rebuild Woman Rink, a man named Bronson Binger held a press conference. At the time, Binger's title was Assistant Parks Commissioner, and his primary responsibility was the renovation of Woman Rink. Binger made a bold, confident announcement to the reporters who showed up. If the Woman isn't ready to reopen in time for next season, he told them, then he'd resign his job. A year passed. The rink obviously didn't reopen, and Binger was true to his word. He resigned. There was just one catch. A short time later, he was named Deputy Commissioner in charge of prison construction for the state of New York. I don't know much about building prisons, but one thing is certain. Renovating ice rinks is a lot easier. You don't reward failure by promoting those responsible for it, because all you get is more failure. The one group that does benefit from the city's incompetence are the contractors who do the work. When a subway project or a new highway or a bridge goes over budget by millions of dollars, contractors clean up. You won't read the names of these people on the Forbes 400, and they may not all speak perfect English, but I'll guarantee you this. Many of them have become immensely wealthy working for New York City. They earn vast sums from huge, unwarranted cost overruns that city officials approve, and taxpayers underwrite. The gala opening celebration for the rink was produced by former skating champions Dick Button and Aja Zanava Stendler. They managed to bring together for one show most of the world's best skaters: Peggy Fleming, Dorothy Hamill, Scott Hamilton, Debbie Thomas, Robin Cousins, Toller Cranston, the teams of Tovia and Dean and Blomberg and Subert and others. It was a great occasion. Had the city then turned over the finished rink to a second-rate operator, this story might still have a bad ending. But because normal competitive bidding would have led to a new delay in opening the rink, the city asked me to operate the rink on a temporary basis for the first season. Again, I just looked for the best rink managers available. The answer I came up with was Ice Capitis. Besides doing great ice shows, Ice Capitis operate some of the best rinks in the country. They've done an impeccable job with Woman Rink. It's not only beautifully run, it's been highly successful. During the 1970s, when the rink was still open and run by the city, it earned an average gross of approximately $100,000 a year and never took in more than $150,000. Although we charged prices below those of any private city rink, $4.50 a session for adults, $2.50 for children. We earned $1.2 million in revenues during our first season. Profits exceeded $500,000 after expenses, and all of it went to charity and the parks department. But equally important, more than 500,000 skaters enjoyed the Woman Rink. Even now, as I write this in the spring of 1987, I get a real kick every time I look out the window of my living room in Trump Tower and see hundreds of skaters on the Woman Rink. However, I won't be one of them. People have been waiting for years to watch me fall, but I'm not about to help the cause. Skating isn't my strong suit. Oh, I love it. Great to read stories like that. It just gave me, totally different perspectives. All right, now I'm going to meditate and call it a day. Thank you for reading with me. See you in my next one. 停止录像。